Jordan Chariton is here. We have a lot to discuss about the 2024 election and some of the things that he saw on the ground. He's the co-founder of Status Quo. Let me go ahead and bring him in. Welcome back, Jordan. What's going on?
Hey there. Thanks for having me. I am recovering in this post-election hellscape.
I feel you, and I can imagine. I know that some people have been very shocked by the presidential election results. I kind of predicted that this was going to happen based on the data, and that Trump continued to gain in the polls and Kamala Harris started to remain stagnant. But there was something that you tweeted about the energy on the ground, in particular young voters. And I want to show people this here. Cyrus actually shared this just to show people how the numbers have changed when it comes to the youth vote. It says that Democrats had the worst performance with the youth vote since John Kerry of 2004. And you guys can see here, it says Harris plus 12, Biden plus 24, Hillary Clinton plus 19, Obama plus 23, Obama plus 34, and then, of course, John Kerry plus 9. And I want to hear from you, Jordan, about some of the things that you presented on Twitter when you were comparing this to Bernie Sanders' campaign and the youth vote.
Yeah, so I went through the numbers because obviously everyone knows 2016 was kind of like the Bernie Woodstock period, and he obviously brought in a lot of people of all ages, but definitely young people. And when you just add millennials and Gen Z, so age 18 to 44, there was a 7% turnout drop. Compared to 2016, 2024. That's pretty significant. Particularly, I mean, when you're looking at like Wisconsin, Trump didn't win he won by less than a point. Michigan won by a little over a point. So Wisconsin was less than 30,000 votes. Michigan was about 80,000 votes. I mean, young people could make that gap. And when you're talking about a 7% drop among basically under 50, that's significant. And the Democratic Party is not going to ask because they don't care. But if that many young people are not turning out, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, people forget, even before October 7th and this genocide, young people were fleeing Biden. Young people were the part of the group that held their nose in 2020 and voted for Biden, not because they loved him, but to stop Orange Man. But they were promised some things, $15 minimum wage, public option, $2,000 checks, which became $1,400 in some weird math equation, stop drilling on public lands, cancel student loan debt, not all of it, but Biden promised some of it. And, right away after the COVID relief bill, which Biden had his highest approval rating after he actually provided some things. Right after that, they started just abandoning the few promises he made and then providing a blank check for this genocide. So I do not think at all it's surprising that the youth vote has dropped. I also don't think it's surprising that when you look at Gen Z men are gravitating more towards Trump. I don't say the Republican Party, I say Trump, because Trump still is able to tap into that anger. And I mean, I'm a millennial and millennials have had it bad, but Gen Z has it perhaps even worse. I mean, they have very little economic prospects. It's becoming more and more of a gig economy, college debt, slaves. So it's not surprising that young people either dropped in turnout or moved over towards Trump.
Yeah. And when you mention that, I think back to Bernie Sanders 2016 and 2020, and he really created a blueprint for how to increase turnout of young voters. He really did. Like, he had a number of economic policies that greatly would help younger people. There were a number of times I spoke to people that were over the age of 65, and they told me, well, I already have Medicare for all, Sabrina. I already have Medicare, right? So, but it was interesting to a lot of people that were under that age group and they did not have health care, or they had inadequate health care. So that was one of the ones. Canceling student loan debt, and I mean all of it, not just the 10,000 or the 20,000 that Biden introduced. There was also, of course, free public college universities. These are all things that younger people are going to be interested in. But the big one to me, I noticed with Kamala Harris, it was very strange to me that her economic policy platform didn't even have the bare minimum, which is a $15 minimum wage. And I would prefer for us to have a living wage, but she didn't even have the bare minimum. It's like, again, Bernie Sanders laid out that blueprint and she didn't pick it up.
You know, it's funny you say that because I made a big stink about this. A couple, like 2 or 3 weeks before the election, we did a swing state reporting trip. So we were in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin for 10 days. And I remember driving through, I think it was in Michigan I saw this, but it was in multiple states, big billboards. Kamala Harris supports the minimum raising the minimum wage. And my response was, to what? Like there was no number. And I think $15 is at this point, not, I mean, it's a joke. You can't live off of $15 an hour either. But she had these vague billboards, and you could say, well, you could fit a number in a billboard. She didn't have a number that she was running on. There was billboards. Kamala Harris supports Social Security. Okay, you got me. You got my vote. I mean, it was all just vague stuff. And you could say, well, Jordan, she was offering more specifics than Trump. But even the specifics she was offering, Senator Chris Murphy, of all people, an establishment Dem, suddenly has seen the light 10 years later. He just did a video saying, these are relatively small ball, proposals that are not meeting the moment. So she's offering $25,000 for first-time home buyers. That's nice, but that's not doing anything to stop Wall Street from buying up all the homes and doubling the price. And that's if you could afford upfront to pay the $25,000 and then get it back. She was offering the $6,000 child tax credit. It's not a bad thing, but we've already done this dance. Biden did a 1-year child tax credit and didn't fight for it. So I think at this point, between the short-term inflation, the long-term inflation, which is the gentrification, housing skyrocketing for decades, I think it was a mix of right now, the short-term economic pain and the cumulative effect. Because real quick, in Michigan, I interviewed three African-American women, probably in their 60s. I could have sworn they were Kamala stans because I was going to a National Action Network rally. This is Al Sharpton's group. So I just assumed, all right, I'm going into Kamala territory and let's see what they say. 2 out of 3 were considering Trump. And it wasn't necessarily because, and these were like knock on doors for 30 years for Democrats, go to all the rallies. These are hardcore vote blue no matter who people, but it wasn't necessarily that they were fed up with Kamala. They were fed up with the Democratic Party, federal, state, and local. They were fed up in Detroit specifically with the gentrification. They were fed up with the tax scams so that the local governments could give real estate developers huge tax subsidies and breaks. They were increasing taxes on low income people. And it was basically just like fuck it and find out vote. We'll just go to Trump because we're tired of the same old broken promises from the Democratic Party. And I don't think that's talked about enough. It wasn't just a rejection of the Democratic Party nationally. So many people, I saw it in Milwaukee too, among younger voters and even older voters that had voted for Democrats, but they just were fed up with the same. You can't tell people over and over and over again, most important election of our lifetime, stop the extremists, and then basically give them Band-Aids for a gaping economic gunshot wound.
That's right. And I'm curious to hear, what did you hear from people in Pennsylvania? Because when I was growing up, Pennsylvania was blue. And I remember the moment that in 2016, when Donald Trump won Pennsylvania, I was very shocked because I was like, really? Pennsylvania just turned red? But what did you hear from people there?
Yeah, I talked to a few black men in particular, and more black men I talked to were for Trump than Harris. And a lot of it was just as simple as prices were lower. I don't love them, but prices were lower. And you really can't blame people for thinking that. Whether there's more context or not, I mean, obviously there was a pandemic, but most voters are not diehard. Most voters don't watch like politics shows on YouTube. They just, kind of pay attention relatively, very close to an election, and they just remember, prices were lower under him. Whether he had anything to do with it or not, really doesn't matter. They just go back to that. A couple of them also said that they had a problem with Kamala Harris's because they knew her record as Attorney General of California, which Trump also, ran ads on. I mean, obviously Donald Trump, Central Park 5, and he's not exactly a civil rights champion. But several of them that I spoke to, I remember interviewing folks outside of the presidential debate in Philly, and several black men were for Trump because Kamala Harris kept innocent men in prison. So it's not just one thing. Yes, by the exit polls, the overwhelming majority of voters voted on the economy, inflation. But I think a lot of people knew Kamala Harris's record. I think, the Democratic Party basically for 20 years has basically been treating different groups like they only like all of them. Top issue is one thing. If it's black people, it's police brutality and voting. If it's Latinos, it's immigration. Well, I mean, Latinos are struggling just like white people. Same thing with black people are struggling just like white people, maybe more. But at the end of the day, most people vote on the economy. And let's not give Joe Biden a pass. There were things he could have done to lower costs. With inflation, he sent some sternly worded letters to oil execs. Well, if you know your history, JFK in 1962, before the CIA got to him, U.S. Steel was jacking up steel prices, basically doing the same stuff the fossil fuel companies are doing. And he held a press conference and he said, "Okay, you want to illegally price gouge? I'm going to pull the submarine contracts from you and give them to other companies." They folded pretty much within a week. You could say, well, that was 1962. I don't know. We give $15 billion in free money, free subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Joe Biden could have dangled that stick. He's not going to do it because Wall Street, who funds the Democratic Party, is the largest investor in fossil fuels. So there were things he could have done similar things with lowering grocery prices. And at the end of the day, whether people loved or hated Bernie Sanders, and I met people over the years on the ground that felt both, Republicans respected him. They knew what he stood for. You didn't have to guess what his policies were. Medicare for all, free college, Green New Deal. Kamala Harris, it was the same thing as Hillary Clinton. She ran the same campaign. Actually, she ran it further to the right, parading around with Liz Cheney. I was expecting Dick Cheney next. At least Hillary Clinton, who did try to get the never Trumper. But there was no core theme or an opportunity economy is just a poll-tested thing that consultants gave to her. It doesn't mean anything. And I think that's why she lost, because to be clear, Trump didn't run a good campaign. He's kind of incoherent too. But I think this was less of an embracement of Donald Trump and more of, hey, everything is too high, whether it was gas, groceries, housing is crazy expensive, utilities, insurance, car insurance, home insurance, utility bills. I saw it all across the country for the last few years. And I think, that's ultimately what did her in.
Yeah, I was trying to sound the alarm about this a couple of months ago. I did a couple of panels on the show with Black voters, with third-party voters. I did a panel in person with Black voters here in Boston. And the consensus that I was receiving from a lot of people was either they were not going to vote, they were going to sit this one out, or they were interested in voting for third party. But I believe only one or two people said they were going to support Kamala Harris. There were a couple that said that they were considering Donald Trump. But the general consensus, I believe, was that they felt like they just did not want to participate this time around. And in reference to the economy, one thing I want to remind people, in 2020, remember, a lot of us were upset and angry about the economy during the pandemic. And typically when that happens, when it's time to vote, people are going to vote against the incumbent party because they're angry about the economy. So that happened during Trump 2020 and people voted against him and Joe Biden won. And now it happened again against the Biden-Harris administration. And I want to show you these numbers as well, because this is another one. I've watched a lot of corporate media pretend that Kamala Harris wasn't pro-Israel enough instead of saying that she lost the Muslim vote. So this was the CARE exit poll. And this is really interesting, you guys. The national presidential exit poll and CARE, they polled Muslim voters. Number one, they're asking, did you vote? So 86.2% did vote, 13.8% did not vote. Who did they vote for? Jill Stein received the Muslim vote, 53.2%. Donald Trump came in second at 21.4%, and Kamala Harris came in third at 20.3%. So even though Jill Stein was a third party candidate, obviously she was very present in the Muslim community about Gaza. She was very present in Dearborn. Kamala Harris did not go to Dearborn. And then a couple of days before the election, Donald Trump did go to Dearborn. But from what I understand, he wasn't really well received by many people. But he still came in second place nationally with the Muslim vote. So the reality is, when it comes to the Muslim voting community, this is a community that really helped carry Joe Biden over the finish line in 2020. And Kamala Harris, there were two demands, permanent ceasefire and arms embargo against Israel. And she just would not do it. She wouldn't do it. And now they're blaming everybody, Jordan. It's everybody's fault except for Kamala Harris.
Well, to be clear, I went to Dearborn 2 months ago, right before the DNC convention. I didn't meet one Arab American. I probably spoken to 20 that said they were voting for Kamala Harris. And that was like when she was, the vibes were good and everybody was joyous. They weren't voting for Kamala Harris because at the end of the day, one person said it best, more empathy doesn't stop the bombs. Harris putting her empathy out didn't stop the bombs. And, what I think is important, I did a video on this early on my YouTube channel. Harris only lost Michigan by 80,000 votes. Donald Trump got 50,000 votes in Dearborn, Dearborn Heights, and Hamtramck, which is heavily Arab American. 50,000 votes in heavily Arab American areas, and Jill Stein got a whole lot of votes. She lost by 80,000 votes. I believe in Michigan, Gaza was the difference because 80,000 votes can be made up very quickly. And it's not just the Arab Americans voting for Jill Stein or Trump. This was young people's top issue. I mean, we've covered over 100 protests. When I say we, my cameraman, John Farina, has been doing incredible work for a year covering these protests in New York, D.C., Chicago, L.A., and not that it's only young people. I mean, older people are out there, all ages. But by and large, this was young people at these protests, their core issue. So I think she lost Michigan. Yes, the economy played a huge role, but I think Gaza could have made the difference. Wisconsin, you wouldn't think so because it's mostly white. But I interviewed the one socialist lawmaker there. He was warning me before the election. He thinks her position on Gaza could be the difference because there's a whole lot of young people that this is their top issue. And there actually was a decent Arab American community around Milwaukee area. She lost Wisconsin by 30,000 votes. So right there are two of those critical swing states. Pennsylvania, she lost by a little more, but I don't think it's just directly the Arab American community. We already went through, we're talking a 7% turnout drop among age 18 to 44 in 8 years. So I think, you know what? I think it would have been a lot closer if she did the right thing. Now let's talk about why she didn't do the right thing. Speculation, but this is not my first rodeo. I've been on the road for almost a decade. At the end of the day, the top donors to the Democratic Party, and I'm Jewish, I'm going to say it, are wealthy Jews. Haim Saban, net worth of $3 billion. He's the guy who stole the Power Rangers from Japan. He, chided in 2018 before this, horrendous genocide. The last time Israel was slaughtering Palestinians in Gaza, the few Democrats that spoke out against it, he sent a harshly worded letter, basically telling them to cut it out because he donated to them. Then this year, that 5-minute pause that Biden did on weapons, which wasn't really a pause, but Biden said he was going to pause weapons. Haim Saban sent a letter to Biden's top advisors, furious. Biden quickly abandoned that. When there was a Palestinian speaker not allowed to speak. This is just speculation. I don't know for fact. But at the DNC convention, at the top were those VIP boxes. I don't know if he was there, but I can tell you what, Jeffrey Katzenberg was the co-chair of Harris Biden's campaign. He's worth almost $1 billion. He's the one who gave TYT all that money. He used to be the CEO of DreamWorks. He's a ardent Zionist. Haim Saban, ardent Zionist. I mean, you're getting, and some of the donors aren't even Jewish, but they're just ardent Zionists. So to me, the Democratic Party still lives in this fantasy where as long as they have the money, they're going to win. Well, Hillary Clinton outspent Trump 2-1. We know how that worked out. Kamala Harris outspent Trump. I don't know the ratio, but by a lot, she lost. So you get what you sow. I mean, put aside the horrible genocide, but think about it. Just if you are a Palestinian American, I mean, we were on the ground at the DNC. John Farina was there. It was like an alternate reality. Inside the convention, it was just like, hope and good vibes, and we're inclusive. They were totally ignoring thousands of people outside as the Chicago police roughed them up, speaking out against this. It had very similar vibes to 2016. I was at the convention then when Hillary and they put on this production ignoring the protests, the Bernie people outside. And it just felt, many times I said, this has 2016 vibes to me because Harris was running the same campaign. Some people will say, well, Jordan, she was thrown into it 100 days. Okay, it would have been a challenge for anyone in 100 days. But at the end of the day, people vote on policy. If you would have proposed even 2 or 3 bold things, we could, obviously we have to be skeptical that she would actually follow through. But if you would have proposed 2 or 3 bold things, if you would have said, yeah, here's what I would do differently than Biden, you might have had somewhat of a shot. But I think the corporate media, we got to be very careful about buying into. It wasn't just about the short-term economic pain right now. Yes, costs are too high. I have seen over the years, I've traveled 35 states in 8 years, been to about 70 or so cities. I've interviewed thousands of people. I think on all sides, left, right, libertarian, no labels, anarchists, I think a lot of people were, for lack of a better phrasing, asleep. And they woke up to the fact that there's been a 40-year bank robbery in this country. And it's called, the transfer of wealth upward. They've woken up to the fact that, no, we can do better. And it's not okay to have to work 2 or 3 jobs. It's not okay to be working longer hours for the same wages. It's not okay that all the money is transferring up. And they shamed Bernie Sanders for pointing these things out. But now you see some of the same Democratic Party elites starting to come to the realization 10 years later, maybe that economic populism is what we need to lean into. I just don't think the party overall is going to lean into it because they're still going to stick with the donors.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Some people are making calls for new leadership within the Democratic Party, but to your point, until you call out the donor money, I mean, I don't think anything's going to really change there. I was saying earlier today that I feel like a lot of people or more people are moving to the right because the Democratic Party failed to fulfill economic policies. And we're talking about just simple things like increasing the minimum wage. Like it's crazy that people in this country don't have health care. Like this does not make any sense. You can go to other countries in the world where everybody has health care. And yet we're one of the wealthiest nations in the world and everyone doesn't have it. So it's like, I think what was frustrating for me is that this really could have been a time for a third party movement really to take off, especially when you think about the issue of Gaza. We spoke to Jill Stein after the campaign, and Jill Stein said, as we got closer to the election day, she said that some voters, particularly in Michigan, really did not want Kamala to win. And they were afraid that if they did vote for Jill Stein, it could risk, still she could win. So some of the Muslim voters in Michigan decided to vote for Donald Trump because they just did not want Kamala Harris to win, didn't want to risk it. But still, when I think about across the country, these third party candidates received more attention this time around than they did in 2016, than they did in 2020. They had more name recognition. Why do you think they didn't receive more support? Like, why do you think the Green Party didn't get to that 5%?
Oh, I know the answer because I hear it all the time. An overwhelming amount of people have no idea who Jill Stein is. Seriously, no disrespect to her. Most people don't even know there are these other options. Most people don't know you could write in Cornel West in X amount of states. And why is that? Because we literally have multi-billion-dollar corporate conglomerates that have hijacked the media in this country. I mean, it's been normalized, but most countries don't have, all of the media consolidated and owned by 6 companies. 6 multi-billion-dollar corporate conglomerates own all the TV stations, all the radio stations, and most of the digital outlets in this country. Let's go back to the Democratic primary for a second. Whatever people think about running as a Democrat. Marianne Williamson ran. I mean, she was ignored, or when she was covered, she was called not a credible candidate. Same thing with RFK Jr. He was either ignored or called a crackpot. I think for the most part, he is a crackpot, but he was running. I mean, he should have been interviewed. I mean, they gave town halls on CNN to Chris Christie, polling at 1%, to Vivek, Ramaswamy, I think he was polling 2 or 3%. Nikki Haley, when she was polling very low. They gave town halls to all the corporate blessed Republicans. They wouldn't give one to Marianne Williamson. They wouldn't give one to RFK Jr. They certainly wouldn't give one to Jill Stein. And I mean, Marianne Williamson was basically having to go on to News Nation and these lower or podcasts. And why this is important, you could say, well, CNN, MSNBC, they're not that highly rated anymore. So what does it matter? That's who the older voters, who are the most reliable voters, who are the most consistent voters, by and large, watch. Not all older voters, plenty of older voters that watch you, that watch me, but by the numbers, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, that is where the baby boomers watch for the most part. New York Times, Washington Post, and they're not getting interviews with Jill Stein, and they're not getting town halls with Jill Stein. They're being told she's a Russian asset, or they're being told she's not credible. So young people who unfortunately are not the most reliable or consistent voters, they're more open to her message because they are consuming alternative media, independent media, podcasts, etc., where you might break through for a third party candidate. And that is why I have said for many years, listen, I get the instinct, and I've covered them, to protest outside BlackRock, to protest outside the White House, outside the Capitol, etc. But I believe the reason we have, by and large, the status quo in this country that we have, and this corporate cesspool of a government, is the media. They are the gatekeepers, for better or worse. And until we, and when I say we, whatever you want to call it, the left, the working class, whatever, start protesting the media, why should CNN, the New York Times, Washington Post, why should these people sit in their ivory tower comfortable? They should have thousands of people outside protesting their skewed coverage of a genocide that the U.S. is funding. They should have thousands of people protesting the fact that they're smearing from Bernie to Jill Stein to Marianne. Even if let's say you don't like Bernie anymore, or Marianne wasn't your person, forget that for a second. They are lying about the candidates closest to progressive and anti-war views, or they're not covering them at all. So if the gatekeepers keep the gate closed, I mean, that's the only way I could say it. I think we need to, they can't ignore hundreds or thousands of people outside their gates. There was one protest in Bernie 2016 that I remember of Bernie people outside CNN. Now, is this the magic pill that's going to solve everything? Of course not. But I think the media gets off way too often and is able to remain comfortable when they are the ones propping up the status quo. They are the ones lying. They're the ones right now. In 2016, they blame Russia. Now they're blaming woke and cancel culture for the reason that Harris lost. I've been doing videos on that. It's a joke. So I think we need to get serious about going after the media. I don't mean violently, I'm talking peacefully, but, boots on the ground works. And sure, building up independent media, but there's too much saturation. There's a gazillion channels. We're all live at the same time, all doing, so we need to do more to counteract corporate propaganda, because for better or worse, and I've seen this time and time again, not just federal, state level and local elections, the most reliable voter is over 50, over 65. I'm not bashing older people. A lot of you are progressive and with it and totally progressive. But unfortunately, the most reliable, consistent voter, the ones that are making the difference when progressive people lose, is older voters who are consuming Morning Joe and Sean Hannity or Anderson Cooper.
These are all really good points, and I'm glad you brought up the media, because I think you have a point there. I think we do need to protest the media. I think we need, and don't get me wrong, I love the protest in DC. Over 500,000 people protesting against, genocide in Gaza, and those protests lasted for over a year. People are still protesting, but the media, to your point, stopped covering it. Everybody noticed this, that corporate media stopped covering those protests. They stopped giving attention to it. They did the same thing.
They never started. They never started. We've been out there for a year. They showed up, took a few pictures, video, and left. They have not. At the DNC, I was shocked. I mean, John was out there, other than a few independent, filmmakers, documentary people, local media showed up, left after 5 minutes. So, yeah.
There you go. And so the other problem too, we saw this happen during the George Floyd protests. Remember in the beginning, like the corporate media was like, look at what's happening in DC, look what's happening here. And then all of a sudden they just stopped talking about it. And so people assumed that it wasn't happening anymore. But, some of those protests did continue. But to that point, does corporate media have some type of accountability here about the hype around Kamala Harris's campaign? Because I would say there were a number of people close to me that thought that Kamala Harris was performing better than she actually was. And I would continue to show them things that they don't have time to look at, like the polls, the data, and where people were moving. And it's like, they would see CNN and they would say, oh, no, she just had this big rally and like Eminem was there and all these people, not realizing that these celebrities are paid. They're paid to appear. They would say she just had this show with Oprah Winfrey and all these celebrities. Again, Oprah was paid $1 million to host that show, just things people don't realize. But it gave some people the impression that she had more support than she actually did, when behind the scenes, we're finding out now, which I'll cover later tonight. Apparently, it was very apparent to people like Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi, which is why they actually wanted an open primary. They did not want Kamala Harris just to be selected. So Joe Biden kind of went against them with that. But I think when I think back to like CNN and MSNBC, I feel like they gave people a false narrative. Even when they covered some of the polls, they would only show polls that showed that Kamala Harris was doing well, instead of showing them a plethora of polls like Nate Silver does. He takes a plethora of polls and takes the average. RCP does the same thing. And it was almost like they wanted to convince people that she was really going to blow Donald Trump out of the water, when talking to people on the ground, that was never the case.
Yeah. First, I want to say I've always felt this, and I think this election in particular shows it even more. There really is a problem in terms of diversity of media. What I mean by that, I'm not talking about skin color or gender, which there is, definitely there definitely needs to be better diversity in both. But there's a diversity in terms of class. Majority of the people that are pontificating and giving you the pulse of America don't even go to grocery stores and shop for themselves. You think Joe Scarborough and Mika go to the shop for themselves? You think Anderson Cooper does his groceries? Most of these people get driven by drivers places. I'm not saying they're horrible people. What I'm saying is, by class, by wealth, they are completely disconnected. Most of the pundits bullshitting and bloviating constantly. I'm not talking just CNN, MSNBC. The columnists, David Brooks, of the New York Times, is the biggest gas bag out there. Has been wrong about everything, between his salary, books, speaking fees. You're talking millions of dollars a year. He just did a column saying maybe we do need to embrace Bernie style politics 10 years later. So if there is no requirement in media, I'm not talking about meritocracy, but if there's no requirement to actually, go out and talk to people, we just drove 600 miles and back for a 10-day, 3-state trip. It ain't easy. It's hard on the body, and it's not cheap. But we do it so we could actually have a pulse of what people are thinking, what people are experiencing. It's easy to sit here, whether you're corporate or independent, and just kind of pontificate. It's a lot harder to go out there and take the pulse. I mean, it's not taking the pulse when reporters go into diners for morning news hits and talk to voters. It is when you go talk to people, not just about polls. We did this 3-state trip. I didn't ask people who they were voting for. I didn't ask people about the polls. I asked them about their local issues. I asked them about what has the Democratic Party done for you locally. I asked them about gentrification. We covered communities are being poisoned, their water, their air. Democratic Party not doing a damn thing for them. Neither is the Republican Party. So there is a huge problem in, again, the gatekeepers never leave the gates. So if you're getting paid millions of dollars to be an anchor, shouldn't you have to go out there and talk to people regularly? When I say people, I don't mean pundits. But they don't do this because, A, it's a lot cheaper to just have a bunch of fucking overpaid idiots on cable news sets pontificating. Very few times they actually have working class people on those sets. Very few times they have voters on those sets consistently, not just as, gimmicky focus groups. So there is a huge, huge problem in terms of diversity and real world experience in the media. And that's why people get the wrong impression that Kamala Harris is up. I knew when I was on the ground in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, I had a feeling Trump was going to win because it was feeling to me like I felt in 2016. And that's the benefit of having going on the ground. That's why, status quo. We appreciate the viewers who fund us because it's not cheap to go. You got to pay for everything: hotels, flights, food, salaries, etc. But that's how you actually get the pulse. Of course, you don't have to travel. You don't have to be in the ground. You could be, there's plenty of people who do commentary that talk to people all over the country that do activism, but those are not the people on CNN, MSNBC, and writing columns for the New York Times and the Washington Post. So I think there's that. They're completely disconnected. And there's also a profit motive for these outlets to make it look closer than it actually is. When they just show the polls and that's all they cover, well, the polls are routinely wrong. If you actually look underneath the hood of the polls, I mean, David Plouffe, who was Kamala Harris, helped Obama get elected. I think he was Obama's 2008 campaign manager. He said on a podcast recently, national polls are bullshit. It's just a sample of a few hundred people. That's all they used in 2016 and 2020 to push the narrative that Hillary was going to crush Bernie, that Biden was beating Bernie. Here is Obama's campaign manager saying they're all bullshit. It's just a couple hundred people. At half the time, it's mostly older people. So at the end of the day, there's profit motive to make it look closer. And most of these people live in a bubble. And when, for example, John King, who's CNN's person on the magic wall, they sent him out there to talk to voters or whatever for a couple months. Well, most of the voters he seemed to be talking to were kind of upper middle class suburbanites. He wasn't talking to, black folks in Milwaukee like I was. He wasn't talking to Hispanics. He wasn't talking to people who have had their water contaminated in Dimock, Pennsylvania for 15 years. So, I mean, this is the problem with media, and it's by design. I mean, look at all these platforms. Elon Musk has taken over Twitter. You think that's going to skew towards the working class? Google owns the platform we're on now. So we got a lot of work to do, but, at the end of the day, I think a huge part of the reason, frankly, I believe a used car salesman won 2 times in 8 years is because at the end of the day, there's been a 40, 50-year neoliberal bubble in this country, and it's beginning to pop.
Yeah, and speaking of that pop, I just want to show people this. This was breaking news earlier today. Speaking of the media, CNN boss Mark Thompson to lay off hundreds after election day ratings wipeout report. So this just came through today. So here we go, guys. This is what I was talking about. It says ratings challenge CNN is reportedly set for a major bloodbath, with boss Mark Thompson expected to lay off high-priced on-air talent as part of wide-ranging layoffs. So here we go again. And it's just, I mean, CNN, I think, is doing the worst when it comes to ratings when you compare it to MSNBC and Fox News. But it's obvious, like, to your point, you don't see Anderson Cooper. He used to, at one point, he used to go out into the field, but you don't see them talking to people on the street. Why is it that they don't have a man on the street series? Like, how back in the day, they used to have like one reporter that would go talk to people on the street. They don't have that. And a lot of these people are millionaires. They're paid a lot of money to just sit there and lie to you.
What's unbelievable to me, and again, I'm not saying this to toot our own horn or this and that, but, status quo, generally, we're on the ground, 8 to 10 trips a year. So last year when we were covering the United Auto Workers strike, we were on the ground for 3 straight weeks. It's really, really expensive to be on the ground for a week, much less 3 weeks. Literally, we were in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois. We even went to Canada because we thought the auto strike was going to spread there. Literally, even the local reporters that came to the picket lines showed up for 5 minutes and left, just like to get 30 seconds for the evening news. We were the only ones consistently there. I could say the same thing for so many other stories. Most of the time when we go out somewhere, 9 out of 10 times, it's just us. A lot of times it's actually foreign crews. I've been to Flint 21 times. A lot of the times it's been me and like French film crews doing a documentary. Foreign film crews covering Flint over the U.S. media. So, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, CNN, even with these layoffs, it's a billion-dollar company. They have all the resources in the world to have reporters in every state in this country, in every state house in this country. They have the abilities to put reporters out to cover activist circles if they wanted to cover protest movements, to cover labor, to cover union, to cover mutual aid. They have all the money in the world, but they're spending it on so Anderson Cooper could get paid what I think is $8 million a year. So that Wolf Blitzer, who's been there for 100 years. And again, they're all there to tell you and cover up the fact that we got 1,000 military bases around the world, that our military budget is, it just keeps growing and growing and growing, while homelessness was up 13% last year. They don't cover those things. And part of it is it's cheaper. They see it. It's cheaper just to have, put Democrat in the left side of the screen, Republican in the right side of the screen, a PR person wearing makeup in the middle, they call a journalist, and let's just have a food fight for 4 minutes until we get to the Viagra commercial. I mean, that's basically what cable news is now. But at the end of the day, they'd get higher ratings if they actually had reporters on the ground actually showing what's going on, but they're not going to do that because CNN is owned by, I think it was AT&T, now it's somebody else. MSNBC, NBC is owned by Comcast. Fox News owned by News Corporation. Washington Post owned by Jeff Bezos. All of these companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year lobbying the federal government that they're supposed to be holding accountable. They're lobbying for tax cuts. They're lobbying for subsidies, deregulation in their industry. You don't think there's a basic conflict of interest? Outside of all the terrible things Bill Clinton did, one of the terrible things he did that people's eyes gloss over, look up the 1996 Telecommunications Act. It helped put on steroids this media deregulation, and what you see is what you get. And that's why I think so many people are going to like Joe Rogan or these bro podcasts. Say what you want. I mean, I like some of his stuff. I don't like some of it, but people are sick of what they see as just scripted propaganda and a tennis volley of talking points. So they go to things that seem more laid back. They go to things that seem more authentic. They go to things where they hear conversations they wouldn't on cable news. But at the end of the day, there's a huge hunger out there for real independent journalism, investigative journalism. But if you have corporate America that basically owns all the media, very rarely you're going to get that.
That's a really good point. Well, I guess my final question for you, Jordan, is what do you think happens next? Because we are seeing a lot of infighting within the Democratic Party that is very public. Bernie Sanders, for once, is really pushing back and saying, no, it was a terrible campaign. I wish he would have said that. I wish he would have said that during the campaign and told her, like, you're not going to get like the working class vote. You're going to lose it, Donald Trump. I wish he was more public about that during that time. You see Nancy Pelosi is coming forward with, it's Joe Biden's fault. It's everybody else's fault except for Kamala Harris. What do you think is going to happen next? In particular with Dem leadership, there may or may not be a change there, but what do you foresee happening, say, come 2028?
Well, first of all, we should applause Kamala Harris for the wisdom of campaigning with Liz Cheney over Bernie Sanders, because I was on the road and sources told me Harris refused to campaign with Bernie Sanders. So say what you want about that. I honestly, unfortunately, I think there's a couple people in the Democratic circles that are getting it. But the leadership is not getting. And frankly, until they're just dead, which I'm not calling for any violence, but until Pelosi goes and Schumer goes and all these old gas bags go, I think it's basically just going to be resistance 2.0. Trump is already doing horrible things. I don't know if you've seen some of these appointments, but it is a long list of warmongers he's appointing. It's going to be the same chaos that we saw. And I think you're just going to have more resistance 2.0. I think the Democratic Party In 2016, they deluded themselves that the problem was it was a fluke. It was just Hillary was a uniquely bad candidate. So we just got to get a better candidate. And they blame Russia. 2020, they learned all the wrong lessons. They thought that Biden winning validated the neoliberal world order is still popular. Well, Biden barely won. They missed that part. And without COVID, I think he would have lost. I think if he would have given another check, he would have won. Trump, speaking of. And I think the lesson they're going to learn from this is it wasn't necessarily our policies were so bad or that we don't have any. It was just, hey, incumbents all around the world have lost in this inflation climate. You're already hearing that talking point. And, it was just she only had 100 days. Blame Biden for running again, for not dropping out early enough. It's not the minimum wage is $7.25. It's not we have some of the most expensive healthcare in the world. It's not all the things we talk about all the time. So I think they're basically going to stick with this resistance 2.0. They think prices are going to go up, which they might because Trump's tariffs, 200% tariffs will rise prices. I also think they're going to lean towards, hey, let's get some outsiders outside D.C. Let's get Gretchen Whitmer, which I could do a whole hour on her because she's corrupt. And the people in Flint and elsewhere could tell you she is awful. Let's look at Gretchen Whitmer. Let's look at Gavin Newsom. Let's look at these popular governors that are younger and could really take it to whoever it's going to be, Vance. And I think that would be all the wrong lessons. It really isn't that complicated. If you give people higher wages, if you give people health care, if you get rid of these, shackles, which are the student loan debt, if you do something real, I'm sorry to the folks who thought like the Inflation Reduction Act was historic climate act. Yeah, tax credits for renewables would have been nice 15 years ago. I don't know about you. It was just like 70 degrees on Halloween where I live. We're fucked. Mm-hmm. So, they're going to look, unless there's some people that really storm the gates of the Democratic Party. Chris Murphy, for example, he's a senator. He just did a video basically saying what I've been saying for 10 years, which is, the neoliberal order is over. It hasn't worked. People are, we're offering small ball policies that don't meet the economic moment, but I don't think those people are going to take leadership. So I think you're basically looking at resistance 2.0.
Interesting. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for your time. And again, where can people find you?
Thanks for having me. Status Coup on YouTube. Finally, we're growing. YouTube seemed to allow us suddenly to grow. So Status COUP. Like I said, we were just on the ground for the swing states. We've been staying on Flint, East Palestine, which is another corporate sacrifice zone that the Democratic Party and Republican Party has abandoned. So definitely watch us on YouTube. And our members call is Thursday night if you want to sign up as a member.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye. All right, guys, check out Jordan, check out Status Coup. Again, they do great work on the ground, you guys. And honestly, like I said before, that's how I found out about the Flint water crisis. It was because of Status Coup, because a lot of other outlets, they didn't really touch that story at all. Interesting how that happens, right? Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.